I'm sure we all have opinions on what makes for good public transport. But then there's a level above, where a form of public transport becomes part of the city's culture. The London Underground is one example. The New York subway is another. The Glasgow subway is a third member of this exclusive club. So I think it's high time I did a video about it. Let's shuggle on down. The subway is a circular route, crossing beneath the River Clyde twice and connecting the north and south of the city. It opened in 1896 and is the third oldest subway system in the world, after the London Underground and the Budapest Metro. It consists of two lines, the inner and the outer, which cover the same route but in different directions. Glasgow got an underground railway for much the same reason that other cities did. Glasgow was known in the 19th century as the second city of empire. It was an ever-expanding industrial metropolis centred on the busy Clyde. This brought the city prosperity, but also problems. The streets were gridlocked. Public transport was limited and expensive, so workers had to live near their place of employment. That resulted in overcrowded slums, the worst in Britain. Normally the obvious solution would be to build more railways, but in the case of Glasgow that just wasn't an option. The city centre was just too crowded. The disruption and demolition that conventional railways would necessitate would only make things worse, as it had in other cities. Trams were popular, but their stop-start operation only made the overall traffic jams worse. In 1894 the Glasgow Central Railway opened, which was built in a tunnel, but it was steam-hauled. Close, but no cigar. Actually, cigars would probably be very unwelcome in those circumstances. The city authorities looked to London for a solution. London was even more crowded, and what was more, it was all but illegal to build railways through the centre of town there. In 1863, the first underground railway in the world, the Metropolitan Railway, opened and was a great success. In 1870, an underground railway called the Tower Subway opened. This was a narrow-diameter underground railway hauled by a cable constructed entirely within a tunnel. That was something of a flop, but in the mid-1880s, the City and South London Railway began construction. This too was a deep-level underground railway, and this seemed to offer a solution. A railway below the streets, causing minimal disruption, entirely unaffected by the traffic above. A number of proposals were put forward for Glasgow. There were ideas for a single line, for a circular line. There was even an idea for a line featuring driverless trains operated mechanically. Soon the concepts coalesced into something very similar to what we actually got, put forward by the Glasgow District Subway Company. Parliament initially rejected the concept because the fear was that if they had to deepen the river, a very real possibility with the heavy traffic on the Clyde, the subway would get in the way. In 1889, the Glasgow Harbour Tunnel was authorised, and the railway's backers seized their opportunity. They basically copied the tunnel proposal and hired Alexander Simpson, engineer on that project, as a consultant. In 1891, approval was granted and a team was assembled. The line was to be 6.5 miles long, with 15 stations. Well, I say 6.5 miles, but ever since the subway opened, distances have been measured in minutes. Not relevant right now, I just thought it was interesting. The tunnels would be dug partly using a tunnelling shield and partly using the cut-and-cover method, where a trench is dug and then covered over. A narrow tunnel diameter of 11 feet was chosen, and the impact of this choice is felt to this day. Digging the tunnel was no easy task. The soil beneath Glasgow is very varied, and that includes clay, sand, sandstone, shale, mud, and hard rock. Much of the soil was saturated with water, so the workings had to be pressurized. 2 men would die as a result of decompression sickness, and several more would be injured. This wasn't the only hazard. Fire broke out twice, on the second occasion killing 2 men. The river broke through the tunnel roof several times, although miraculously nobody seems to have been hurt in those incidents. Unsurprisingly, the project went over budget. Tunnels took different shapes depending on what they were dug through. They were round through soft soil, horseshoe-shaped through rock, and were lined with cast iron, brick, or brick and concrete, as appropriate. As the tunnels were being dug, the question arose of operation. The narrow tunnels meant that the standard track gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches used on most railways in Britain could not be adopted. Instead, a gauge of 4 feet, or 1,219 millimetres if you prefer, was employed. Then there was the question of motive power. Steam locomotives were out of the question, but electric trains were relatively primitive at the time. Instead, cable haulage was chosen. A powerhouse was built on Scotland Street that would contain steam engines to wind the cables. This method had a number of advantages. Lightweight, cheaper rails could be used since they didn't have to hold the weight of a locomotive. Since all the trains would be connected to the same cable, it meant that the weight of trains going down gradients could help other trains going up. The trains would use a gripper. This would grab the cable when the train needed to move and disengage when they needed to stop. This mode of operation, and the circular route with no sidings or branches, meant that the system was built without points. The only way to get a train off the track was using the hoist at the depot at Broomloan, physically lifting the carriages off one by one. The first trains were designed by company engineer David Morton and built by the Oldbury Carriage and Wagon Company. They had a number of curious features. As the stations all had island platforms and the trains only moved in one direction, the carriages featured an elaborate livery on one side and a plain single colour on the other. Passengers entered via gates, which again were only on one side. While the company had rejected electricity for haulage, the carriages were electrically lit, picking up from a pair of wires alongside the train. There were also several four-wheeled trailer cars built by Hurst Nelson, upon which smoking was allowed and, according to the book Circles Under the Clyde, spittoons were carried. Half of one of these trailers was preserved at Buchanan Street, but was removed during modernization and has been scrapped within the last decade. The early stations were quite discreet at street level, often being built into existing tenements. The most notable exception must surely be St. Enoch, which was grand enough to appear in advertising and still exists, albeit having been converted into a coffee shop. Platforms were wooden, the walls were whitewashed, and the corridors were lined with white tiles. All the better to emphasise how much cleaner the subway was than the conventional railways. On the 14th of December 1896 the line was opened. It was hugely popular. Too popular, in fact, and the stations quickly became overcrowded. A collision occurred at St. Enoch between a stationary and oncoming train, resulting in 2 injuries. That was too many for a line that boasted of its safety precautions. The Board of Trade ruled that the subway should close until improvements had been made. On the 21st of January 1897 the line reopened. It was, at least at first, a great success. Once the full complement of trains were in service, the subway offered the fastest way around the city. Workers on the Clyde would often make 4 journeys a day. To work, back home for lunch, back to work, back home again. But the golden age would be short-lived. The trams fought back with a programme of electrification completed in 1901, which sped them up substantially. With their more extensive network, they poached many of the subway's passengers. 1901 saw the subway staff adopt black braiding as part of their uniforms, as a form of mourning. For the late Queen Victoria, not for the passengers lost to trams. That was still part of the uniform into the 1970s. The subway cost substantially more to run than the trams. It required considerably more staff with more specialised expertise. The winding engines were coal-hungry. As early as 1898 it was declared that the subway was operating at a loss. By the end of the First World War this had begun to impact the staff, who were being paid below the rate of inflation. In desperation, the company approached the Glasgow Corporation about a takeover. After fierce negotiations, the corporation bought it for the knockdown price of £385,000. In March 1922 they closed the whole thing down and reopened it in July that year. The official takeover didn't happen until 1923, which I guess is one of those bits of legal mumbo-jumbo that doesn't make for a very interesting video. The corporation takeover meant a number of things. Firstly, it meant that the line's future was secure, at least for the time being. Secondly, it meant that things could be integrated. Some of the tram routes were reworked so as not to compete with the subway. And thirdly, modernization could be considered. Cable haulage had been a selling point when the subway opened, but by the 1920s it was definitely old hat. So in 1932 they began experimenting with the concept of electrification, and in 1935 they carried it out. Electricity would be drawn from the corporation's own power station at Pinkerton, same as the trams. The trains were actually just the old cable-hauled stock with tram motors installed. They were repainted in a red and cream livery. At the same time, wooden platforms were replaced due to fire risk, and signalling was modernised. Apparently the wooden platforms were much missed by some passengers, since legend had it that the creosote fumes were good for bronchial complaints. I am not a doctor, nor am I a Glaswegian, so I cannot confirm or deny this. In 1936, the system as a whole was officially renamed the Underground. I'm going to keep calling it the subway, as did just about everyone else at the time. Locals did, estate agents did, even some official documents published by the corporation did. During the Second World War, the subway was used as an air raid shelter, but on the 18th of September 1940, a bomb struck just south of Merkland Street Station, piercing the roof of the tunnel. There were no casualties, but it highlights the fact that the subway is, in many places, just not very deep. That aside, the war was boom time for the subway. The Clyde was a major shipbuilding centre. More demand for ships meant more workers, which meant more commuters. Following the war, though, things subsided once again. The council apparently didn't learn the lessons of history, preferring to invest in buses rather than improving or expanding the subway. Reports commissioned in 1922, 1948 and 1954 all concluded that the subway could be an important asset if it received adequate investment, which of course it didn't. The feeling was that if nothing had worked so far to make it profitable, a bigger investment would just be a waste of money. The reports were ignored. No one in a position to do anything cared. The system became ever more dilapidated. Essentially, people were still riding a Victorian system. Same trains, same stations, same route. There was no will to expand. The trains were so old that parts were no longer manufactured for them. The fitters were forced to obtain parts from scrapped main-line trains and trams, and to bodge them as best they could. The overall result was a kind of vicious circle, so to speak. Because there was no investment, the subway became a money pit. The system required more staff than comparable forms of transport because technologies that could have reduced the number of staff needed weren't in place. The trains cost a fortune to maintain because they were absolutely ancient. They were corroded and jury-rigged, so of course they broke down a lot. Staff morale was, as you might expect, low. All of this made the subway deeply unattractive to passengers. But underinvestment wasn't the only issue. Glasgow in the second half of the 20th century was not the same city it had been in the 1890s. Industries were closing. People were moving from the inner city to the suburbs. Car ownership rose drastically in the post-war years, and the main line stations that the subway connected with had been closed. There just wasn't the same level of demand that there had been. Another report in 1970 suggested 3 possible courses of action: continue patching things up, proper modernisation, or just call it a day and close the whole thing down. A report in 1971 was even more damning, describing the subway as life expired. In 1973, the Greater Glasgow Public Transport Executive took the city's transport over, including, of course, the subway. They proposed a radical solution: total modernisation. No more painting over the cracks, no more half measures. This was seen as an essential part of regenerating the city. Civic approval for modernisation was given, money was paid out, and in 1977 the subway closed. Again. Well, that is apart from Govan, which had to be closed prematurely due to cracks appearing in the roof. The modernisation programme would involve total rebuilding of the stations, better connections with other forms of transport, new rolling stock and total renewal of infrastructure. No more hoisting trains off the track. As part of all this, Merkland Street was closed and replaced with Partick. To this day, Merkland Street is the only abandoned station on the line. At surface level, the entrance was roughly where the entrance to Partick is. In 1980, the system reopened. Some of the stations had their below-ground layout altered, too, no longer being island platforms. Not only were there new stations, but new trains. Oldbury had long since been taken over by Metro Camel, who supplied the new trains to a bespoke design. Originally, this was a joint project between GGPTE, the Glasgow School of Art, and Noel Herring Associates. Despite the full modernisation, the system had significant constraints in terms of tunnel size and track curves. Nevertheless, the trains were designed to be faster, more comfortable, and more visually appealing. I've heard of trains being designed for strength, speed, and durability, but I've never heard of a train being designed for cuteness before. The trains also operate automatically, although the drivers are still required to set everything in motion. And for safety reasons, of course. Also, if you're a YouTuber standing there waiting to get a shot of the train leaving, they will point out the exit to you in case you're confused. The trains were mostly painted in variations on the theme of orange, part of the design brief being to avoid liveries that could be seen as endorsing any local football team. After the first demonstration of the modernised system, the press were very quick to dub it the Clockwork Orange. The original colour was officially known as red for fear that calling it orange would imply links with the Orange Order. In which case, I sort of feel like, why paint it orange in the first place? Several cars over the years have sported other liveries. In fact, you may have spotted a few of them in this very video. Another effect of the modernisation was the introduction of evening trains. Prior to this, the subway stopped at 7 p.m. There were also experiments with running trains at Christmas and New Year, but demand wasn't high enough. That being said, Father Christmas was a common sight at the controls of the trains and making charitable collections around the festive season. So if you've ever wondered what Santa does when he's not delivering presents, he's driving subway trains in Glasgow. In 1982, the subway pioneered the concept of poems in subway carriages, with a series of funny but controversial poems by Edwin Morgan. The transport executive did not see the funny side, and explained that the poems were an inaccurate portrayal of the subway. They explained that despite what you might have read in the poems, there was no smoking or drinking allowed, there were no guards, and each train did not, in fact, contain a tank of hungry piranhas. Morgan's work would later be published on the London Underground and the Paris Metro. In the 1980s, GGPTE was replaced with Strathclyde Passenger Transport, who run things to this day. In the early 2000s, there was another identity change. The subway stopped being called Underground and was renamed Subway once more. I recall visiting Glasgow in 2005 and being quite confused that some of the signs had an S and some had a U. There are many Glaswegians who still refer to it as the Underground to this day. At least if the comments on my Instagram are anything to go by. The next round of investment fortunately did not take 80 years to come around, and in 2010 another modernisation scheme was approved. This included electronic ticketing, better accessibility, and new trains built by Stadler Rail, along with various rounds of repair. The trains came into service in 2023. The old ones were withdrawn, with the last going out of service in June 2024. One of the old subway cars joined its even older brethren at the Riverside Museum, where you can see it today. The new trains are walk-through, wheelchair accessible, and air-conditioned. They also have the potential for completely driverless operation, and as part of the necessary safety measures to make driverless operation work, they are compatible with platform screen doors. Fond though I am of the old trains, it can't be denied that the new ones are an improvement if you're not a weirdo train nerd. All that being said, in the short period between me filming this and the video coming out, an article was published saying that they've had to fit additional dampers to the trains since bringing them into service. It seems that neither SPT nor Stadler realised just how shaky this line is. Modernization is tricky. The present-day subway has to work with many of the faults and compromises introduced back in the 1890s. Problems like water leakage and shaking, or shugaling as it's known locally, are still an issue to this day. What of the future? Environmental and traffic concerns have once again swung the pendulum of public opinion back in the direction of public transport. Every so often there will be talk of expanding the network. In 2007, Strathclyde Passenger Transport conducted a survey and produced yet another report, this one in favour of extension. Conversely, in 2013, Peter White of the University of Westminster argued for its closure as a relatively low-usage system. At present, though, the favoured scheme seems to be the Clyde Metro, a mix of new and rebuilt old lines, not dissimilar to the Docklands Light Railway or the Tyne and Wear Metro. The subway has its critics and its naysayers. There is no denying that it has its faults, but I think this is the case for any rail system above a certain age. Despite this, people have a lot of affection for it. It has a lot of charm. Personally, I love it. I think there would be an outcry if it went, and not just because of the loss of a mode of public transport. It may not be perfect, but it's a living part of Glasgow's heritage. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this story from the subway. As you may have gathered from the footage, it took quite a long time to make. In fact, I started making it back in 2022. But I enjoyed filming it. I have to say I really like the subway. I mean, I'm not a regular commuter, but as a tourist, I thought it was fantastic. I know the subway has its fans, and I hope I didn't disappoint you guys. If you liked this video, please do click the like button and subscribe for more. Thanks as ever to my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon, as well as here on YouTube. You are the Shoogaloo to my seat. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.